Hello, this is Leadership Live. I'm David Rubenstein, coming to you from my home in Bethesda, Maryland. A home, as I've said before, I've spent more time in the last 30 days than I have in the last 30 years. I have always been interested in leadership, but I'm particularly interested in leadership in times of crisis. And we have a healthcare and a economic crisis right now. And I always want to know, how are people who are leaders getting through this leadership crisis? And so we're very fortunate to have a number of people be willing to let me talk to them. And today we're particularly fortunate to have somebody who's been in the middle of a food crisis in the view of some people, and that is Dave MacLennan. Dave is coming to us from Minnetonka, Minnesota, which is the headquarters of Cargill. Dave is the CEO of Cargill. He's been the CEO about 7 years now, been in the company for almost 29 years, a little bit more than 29 years. And he's a person who knows the food world extremely well. So Dave, welcome very much to the show, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Now, Cargill is a company that is privately owned. It's the largest privately owned company in the United States. Is that right?
I think that's correct by sales, yes.
And so your principal business is what? It's food production, food distribution, food trading?
Yeah, it's all of that. So it's food production. I mean, everything from beef to poultry to chocolate, but also food ingredients, things that go into prepared foods or that occur in other foods. There's also food for livestock as well. We do have a trading business, both financial and agricultural products. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Cargill does.
And did you grow up saying, I want to be in the food business? How did you get into the food business?
You know, my first job out of college was in Chicago at the Chicago Board of Trade, and I got hooked on markets and just instantaneous price discovery, seeing the traders on the floor and how supply and demand work, up close. I then got my MBA in finance, and when I joined Cargill, I started in the financial arm of the company. It was basically distressed asset investing at the time. But then as I got older and became, more involved in my career at the company, I thought this is a food company, not a financial company. And so I started developing my career more in the food side as I got more advanced in my career.
And how many employees does Cargill have now around the world?
We have 160,000 employees in over 70 countries. If you count the countries where we sell but don't have a physical presence, it's probably closer to 125 countries.
Now, this week, John Tyson, who's the head of Tyson Foods, a competitor of yours, I assume, in certain areas, said that the food chain was maybe breaking down in this country. We're going to have to close facilities. Do you agree with that? And are you worried that the food chain is breaking down?
I think I would characterize it that the food supply chain is under strain, but there's a lot of supply chains that are under strain due to what's happening. And certainly there have been food production facilities in various parts of the country that have had to close because of illness or because of supply destruction. But I think basically the ability of us to produce food is still there. There are going to be momentary closings. Momentary isn't the right word, but we had a beef facility that was closed for 17 days, but it's now back up and running and has been for the last week. So I think the food industry and the food supply chain is resilient. I think the people that work in it every day are resilient. So I think it's under strain, but I don't think it's broken.
Well, in response to Mr. Tyson, I think the president issued an executive order today saying that under the Defense Production Act, he is going to, in effect, command that food production companies stay in business and make their workers go to work, assuming that they have appropriate protection. He's going to make sure they have enough equipment and other PPE to make sure that they're operating safely. Are you aware of that executive order, and do you think that's necessary to make sure that you can produce the food you want in your facilities?
I am aware of it. I saw it on the headline right before we sat down together, so I don't know the details, but it's going to call the question of keeping the American public fed to keep food on the shelves, but also balancing that with the health needs and the concerns, and also the emotional health of the workers in the plants. So we're going to have to find the balance between the two. Of course, if you have illnesses at a plant such that you can't run, you don't have a choice. Or if you have certain vital functions in the plant that are ill and can't come to work, then you can't run the plant either. But so far, I think by and large, we've been able to the industry has been able to run. We've had tremendous support from the USDA in terms of having the inspectors on site. You can't run a plant without USDA inspectors. So I think it remains to be seen of how we're going to manage that dynamic between the health and emotional safety and physical safety of the workers in the plants and the executive order, of which we're still studying the details.
Well, let's talk about, for people that don't really understand exactly how meat is produced. Meat is produced in large facilities where people are working very closely together. So is the problem because they're so close together, you have to make certain that they're not going to get this virus? And how are you now doing that? And how might you do that under the new president's executive order?
Well, I mean, we have taken a lot of different steps in the last 2 months since the virus began to expand. So everybody at our facilities is temperature checked before they come in. If they show any signs of any symptoms of COVID, they are asked to leave and quarantine for 14 days, not leave the facility, but leave the parking lot. Everybody has a face mask. We have no visitors are allowed in the plant. We have appropriate physical spacing in the lunchrooms. We put up plastic dividers if people can't have appropriate physical spacing. To your point, there's a lot of people in these facilities, a lot of brave and courageous people that come to work every day and that take their obligation to putting food on the shelves very seriously. There was a sign at one of our plants that someone had written that said, "Thank you to all the employees of this facility. You are feeding 22 million people a day." So the amount of production that's coming out of one beef facility is pretty substantial, but many steps have been taken to ensure the safety and health of the employees.
Now, presumably, out of the 330 million people in the United States, they're eating pretty much the same amount of food they ate before, but they're eating it differently and in different places. So, explain to people who are watching why, for example, people now have to, let's say, not produce as much food in certain areas because restaurants aren't open, or places like McDonald's don't have as much traffic as they used to. How has this changed the food distribution and manufacturing business?
Well, I mean, there's been a significant shift, as you would imagine, from food service to retail. And with restaurants, quick serve and white tablecloth and fast casual, all the different categories have been significantly impacted by stay-at-home orders. I would say this, that the orders for food service in the first 3 weeks, let's go back to March 1st, showed significant declines. There has been subtle increases in the last 3 weeks because I think number one is restaurants are getting used to whether it's curbside pickup or home delivery, takeout, whatever forms it may take. I think number two, consumers are getting used to it and becoming more comfortable with the idea of I can't go to my favorite restaurant, so I will allow, I'll have them, I'll do whether it's Uber Eats or one of the DoorDash or one of the services that can deliver to me, or sometimes the restaurants are delivering themselves. So the shift from food service to retail has been substantial. And you could then start to talk about, okay, are people eating the same amounts of calories when they're stay at home and consuming shelf stable foods versus going out? The fact is, from going to restaurants, portions are significant. And so whereas they may not be eating all of the portions, the volumes tend to be larger in food service than they do in retail. But the nature of the way Americans consume their food absolutely has changed dramatically in the last 2 months.
I think I just read that the average person in the United States eats roughly 5 meals a week outside of their home historically. And now it's maybe just one or two. So people are eating more at home. And I guess if you're eating more at home, you're cooking more at home. And is it a different type of packaging that you need for producing food for people that are going to eat at home as opposed to selling it to restaurants or places like McDonald's?
It is because you're selling more individual packaging when you're cooking at home or smaller packaging, as opposed to a McDonald's or a quick serve restaurant, or they may buy like bulk packages of eggs that they can use, or maybe they're prepared eggs, and so for sure the volumes that you see at the retail level are smaller, or portion sizes, I should say. The good news, and as I mentioned, we had the beef facility that was closed and it's reopened, is we had closed a couple of our egg facilities since we are an egg supplier to various restaurants, quick serve restaurants around the country. And we have ramped up capacity in the last couple of weeks as we've seen examples of demand coming back, as I referred to. So, but the packaging, to your point, is you might buy at a restaurant or a McDonald's or a quick serve restaurant, they might buy a package of, say, 100 eggs that have been shelled already. to have in storage or for that day's cooking. You're not going to see that at home cooking, obviously.
Now, obviously, at some point, these animals are going to be killed, the cattle or the chickens or the pigs. But now reports are that they're being killed earlier than normal because there's not enough demand for their meat. For example, pigs, there's not as much demand for pork, I guess, as before. So pigs or piglets are now being killed earlier than they would have otherwise been. Is that true?
Well, it's starting to show up. It's certainly starting to occur, and it's two pieces, David, which is one is demand. So as I mentioned, at food service, where people can't go out to eat, or the demand for curbside or delivery or pickup is not the same as is lower than it is for in restaurants. So indeed, demand has come down on the food service side. There was a story in the local paper in Minnesota, which described a chicken farmer that raised the chickens to produce the eggs that had to euthanize over 25,000 chickens simply because it becomes more expensive. The eggs are not being converted or sold into food service. But on the side, in the level of, or the component of pork and beef, I think more of that is about plants being closed. So yes, it's technically demand, but it's not necessarily demand at the consumer level. It's the fact that many plants have had to close that process beef and pork. And so then there's a backup in the supply chain.
One of the phenomenon that I've been watching as well, which is often hard to believe, is the enormous amount of cars that are lined up for food in the United States at food banks or their equivalent. Are you surprised that there's so much demand for food from people who really, I guess now, probably can't afford to buy it in the normal prices?
I'm not surprised. I mean, I think one of the things the crisis is highlighting is that the people that are most vulnerable are the people that are the hardest hit. And I think the fact is, food for many people is unaffordable or very expensive. And so I think so one of the things we're doing and many companies are doing is supporting food shelves and food pantries, not only with money, but also with in-kind donations and donations of meals. But the fact is, food is harder to get access to with the closure of some restaurants. And so the lines that we're seeing it doesn't surprise me, to be honest with you.
In the food world, you are at the top. I presume you're doing reasonably well financially. You don't disclose your earnings. You haven't disclosed them this quarter. But can you say you're doing okay, or it's really impacting you financially?
I'd say we're doing okay. I mean, as you said, we're private, so we have released our earnings. We have the unusual circumstance. It's just by virtue of timing, is that our fiscal year runs June 1st to May 31st. So we are basically in the middle of our fourth fiscal quarter. So the first three quarters, I mean, it's pre-COVID and after COVID. The first three quarters were all pre-COVID. If you look at March 1st, just to pick not a random date, but to pick a date as to when things started. So, in the fourth quarter, certainly a pickup in retail has been helpful, but there's also been demand destruction, as I've
Right.
talked about, in food service. But, I'd say we're doing okay.
So if you look at the stocks that have been hard hit in the food area are the food restaurants and chains like that. But the ones that are doing well, the ones that had problems before, packaged goods and packaged food products, is that a surprise to you that many of them are now doing much better than before, like Kraft Heinz and so forth?
It's not. I mean, you see the shift from eating away, and as you mentioned, an average of 5 meals a week, and maybe it's down to one or zero, just because they can't get to their favorite restaurants. But our family is cooking at home. We're cooking at home more than we ever have. And the fact is, companies, as you mentioned, Kraft Heinz or ConAgra or Campbell's, people are buying packaged foods, and they're buying shelf-stable foods. So they're buying things that are going to last for a while. And in some cases, there have been examples of panic buying and hoarding, where people don't know how long this is going to last, and if supplies of their favorite foods are going to be available in a couple of weeks or a couple of months' time. So I think there's some accelerated demand, but overall, people are buying things with, whether it's familiar brands or things that they know are going to be able to last on the shelf for a while. But it's a replacement because they can't go out as frequently as they could before.
Panic buying was prevalent, let's say a few weeks ago. It seems to have leveled off, but is there going to be enough food for everybody? So should I go out and panic buy some things tonight, or is there going to be enough food in the food stores for me to get food anytime I want?
It's going to depend on where you are, and it's going to depend on your proximity to where the food is produced, and also to the demographics and the buying profile of the local stores. But I would maintain that there is enough food in the system. You may see temporary supply disruptions. For example, you talked about pork, and pork production, for reasons that I talked about, and beef production is down about 25 to 30% from typical levels. However, so just data point of one, I went in my local grocery store last night, and the meat shelves were fully stocked: pork, chicken, beef, fish. But what was not there, still toilet paper, and canned soups. There was nothing. And so people, I think, have been buying up a lot of, as I mentioned, shelf stable products. But there's enough food in the system. But I understand, I mean, animal instincts kick in and people get afraid. And so rather than think, okay, well, the food system will be up and running, and whether it's through the executive order or plants coming back online as employees get healthy again, and as testing becomes more prevalent, the food supply chain is resilient, as I mentioned.
Now, when the CEO of Cargill goes into a food store, do people, run over to service you, or they know who you are, and you get any discounts in the food stores because when you show up, you're the CEO of the largest food company?
About 2 years ago, we make a turkey called honeysuckle white, and I went in and I was just checking out the turkeys, and the guy came over and said, "I know who you are," and I said I was just checking out our turkeys and seeing how they're positioned. But I went in last night and I wore a mask, so I was
Oh.
incognito. Nobody recognized me, and I was perfectly happy to do it that way.
Now, talk about farmers. That's the beginning part of the food chain in many ways. Are farmers suffering enormous financial losses, or are they being subsidized in effect by the US government? Are farmers going to go out of business? Are there going to be bankruptcies among farmers or not?
Well, I'm very concerned about the farm community. So they've had the support, and certain components of the ag sector have had government support. But the fact is, as you were alluding to, work your way back on the supply chain. So if you have plants to go down because of illness or because of demand destruction, which means the livestock starts to back up, and maybe some of the animals have to be euthanized. I think in the case of beef, you can change their diets, you can slow down the processing or slow down the growth, and so there probably is less incident of euthanization of that particular species. But then they all are also eating products. Their feed is grown by the farmers, and the majority of products that are grown in the U.S. of row crops go into feeding the livestock. So I am concerned about farmers. Prices have been low for a long time. There is, the good news is there's plenty of supply in the system. There's plenty in storage, but it means that the prices are low, and that I think bankruptcies last year in certain segments of the ag sector were at record highs. So it's something that we're keeping a very careful and thoughtful eye on, and they're a community that needs to be supported.
So if I wanted to invest in something in the food chain now, given where we are, should I invest in farming communities? Should I invest in producers of food? Should I invest in wholesalers? Should I invest in traders? Should I invest in retail,
Hmm.
uh, restaurants? What would you recommend?
I think I think the switch from food service to retail, there's going to be some permanent level of shift, and you can see different statistics and different prognostications about how many restaurants are going to reopen, and certainly there'll be some that they were small or they were niche that won't be able to reopen, and therefore I think retailers will pick up that demand. I also think I would call them healthy ingredients or organic foods. Things like probiotics, prebiotics are going to increase in popularity. So we've got a product, for example, that we make for human consumption called Epicor, which is a digestive supplement, which has been shown to create greater health. So I think those kind of things that people can supplement their diets with, and supplement their at-home cooking with, especially in light of a pandemic. I think those are going to do well in the future.
So it's probably not a big part of your business, but food trucks all over the country, they seem to sell food to a lot of people, and they're small businesses if ever there were small businesses. Are you worried that they're going to go out of business?
No, I mean they're mobile restaurants, right? And so it's a form of at-home eating or curbside or door delivery that food trucks can move around to locations as opposed to bricks and mortar restaurants where they are where they are. You know, your rent's going to be a lot lower, obviously, with a food truck than it is with a restaurant. But I think that segment
Okay.
of consumption and food service probably should do pretty well in the future.
Now, let me ask you how you're managing this your company now. You're mostly working out of your home, but sometimes you go to your office. Um, is it hard to manage this way because most of your employees are probably at home, I assume? So, what have you learned about how to manage your company? It's a gigantic company. How hard is it to manage in this manner?
I think we've all adapted pretty well to communicating, whether it's on Zoom or Skype or by phone. I think everyone has been struck, and I don't think this is unique to Cargill, that it can be done. I miss the face-to-face interaction. I saw a couple of people in the office today, and it was almost startling to see some other faces other than the ones that you're sequestered with. And I think part of our culture has been the social relationships that develop in a company over we're 155 years old. So I miss that aspect of it. But the building that I'm in today has capacity for 2,500 people. I don't think we'll ever see that many people in the building again. I think some people are going to decide, you know what, I like working at home. I can be effective. I can, get my work done at my home computer, my home laptop or PC, and be perfectly effective. But I think there are some people that just will want to continue to have the social interaction when they feel safe. But I think that's been one of the biggest takeaways is technology has performed very well, and you can be effective in your job, in most jobs, working remotely.
The ones who want to stay at home in the future may not be ones with small kids and dogs, but that's another matter.
It
So let me ask you, if you have the ability to bring all your employees back, I guess you will do so. But I'm told that some CEOs say, now I don't need as many employees as I thought I did before, and maybe I won't bring them all back. Is that something you think is a prevalent view in the CEO community that you can downsize in the future?
I don't think it's a prevalent view today. And, Minneapolis, St. Paul is unique, and we've got roughly 20 Fortune 500 sized public and private companies headquartered in the Twin Cities community. So there's a lot of conversation about, resuming work and physical distancing and when to do it. The state of Minnesota, our stay-at-home order expires on Monday the 4th. And I don't think there's any headquarters company here in Minneapolis, St. Paul that is going to open the doors and say, everybody come back. We're all, thinking about how do we do this? How do we have intelligent sequencing? What steps do we need to take, whether it's temperature taking, everybody wearing masks? But I have not heard anybody in this community or really any of the CEOs that I've been talking to talking about we've got to get rid of people. And actually, I really hope that what has happened changes the ethos of this country into realizing that the impact that this has had on the most vulnerable, on the people that are suffering the most, that has made it worse, and that there's more a sense of the phrase that was being used prominently, as you know, in the last year or two, is responsible capitalism. So from our standpoint, if we don't have, I hope that we don't have to lay anybody off other than I've mentioned we've had to close some plants because of demand, but that's our objective. But I don't think anybody's thinking that way at this point in time.
Under the trade agreement that the Trump administration negotiated with the Chinese are supposed to buy a lot of food products from the United States. Do you think, in light of their economy slowing down, they'll be able to do that? And do you see any evidence that they are doing it now?
I don't think certainly their economy has slowed down, but as I mentioned, we're up and running in China. All of our plants are running, and so they're in the call it the recovery stage. But I think the fact of the matter is 1.4 billion people have to eat. And the Chinese depend on the outside world on trade in order to feed their livestock or to supply their animal protein, for example, and other products to their population. So I do believe that they will be able to fulfill their commitments under the trade agreement that was cut, despite an economic slowdown. And we're better placed to turn than the United States to get those products. But it's planting season in North America. So ultimately, when harvest season comes in late summer, early fall, that's when you might expect to see bulk purchases of commodities going to China.
Where around the world do you see in your business weaknesses? In Europe, emerging markets, Asia, or are they all roughly the same now?
No, I mean, I would say Asia. I would carve out China, which I described, and South Korea. I mean, those are, they've had some early rebounds. I think Southeast Asia is probably still, dealing with some of the issues. Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore has gone back on quarantine with a spike up in illnesses. Western Europe is ahead of the curve, in more ways than one. They got after it faster, and it's well publicized. Places like Germany and Italy and Spain are starting to come back online. I think Austria started relaxing stay-at-home rules. So they are ahead of where the United States is. I think South America is a mixed bag. I mean, some severe examples in South America, but probably pretty similar to the United States. So it's mixed, but when you have, as I mentioned, over 70 countries in the world like Cargill does, it's a diverse portfolio that provides this diversity in terms of results and in terms of where the outbreaks are.
Now, you're in the distribution business. When you distribute food around the world that you manufacture, you produce, are you doing it through trains, planes, trucks, boats? And are those systems all working as well as they did before?
Yeah, I mean, it's all of the above. It's mostly rail, truck, barge, and ocean-borne transportation. So one of the fun facts about Cargill is at any point in time, there's about 550 ships on the ocean with a Cargill sourced product on at any point in time. But those systems, and if you think about the American food system, and as you were tracing the supply chain back to the farmer, to the livestock producers, to the plant operators, to the retailers. It's also the transportation system. And so the courage of the truck drivers and the people and the train operators, I mean, we depend on all of that. And it's something that people, I think, take for granted. They don't realize how much goes into manufacturing and distributing food. But to your point,
Right.
we're seeing the capacity. And when I had spoken to the White House in the past, I said, can you make sure we get the inspectors in the plants done? USDA Secretary Perdue has done a great job of that. Can you help us make sure we have access to transportation and logistics to get the food to where it's needed? And yes, it is performing very well.
So, how is your relationship with the administration, the White House? Do they consult you? Do you talk to them for regularly, or how does that work?
I have found the administration, but also members of Congress, to be very good listeners. And I have had some inbound calls where members of Congress have called us and said, how can we help? What do you need? How can we help keep the food supply system running? I've been on 2 calls with the White House and the administration, again, asking for what do you need? And one was very early on in the process. So it was like second week of March. And one was more recently with other industries, not just food, but also construction and energy, and some other industries as well. But I have found them to be very solicitous of what we need, what kind of support that we need to have to keep, testing, to keep employees safe, and to help make sure that the plant workers who are on the front line every day are well protected, both physically and emotionally.
So, I always like to worry about something going wrong. I always look at the glass as being a half empty, I guess. So, if I wanted to worry about something in the food world that you live in, what should I worry about?
I would only say that, as I said, there may be some spot shortages of certain kinds of protein. You might not be able to get, the exact cut of beef, pork, or chicken that you want to have, but ultimately the production is continuing, and the plants are coming back online to keep the food system safe and to keep it operating. But overall, I sleep very well at night, and I think you should too, David.
Okay. What lesson have you taken away from this experience? Are you going to manage your company differently in the future? Are you going to change a lot of things that you've done? Or basically you say, hey, I got a pretty good system now and I don't need to change very much?
Boy, I think, if we don't change, and if the world's going to change, right, economically and socially, everything is going to change. And so we'll change along with it. But I think the role of technology in our business and everybody's business has become more clear and more pronounced than ever. I think the resilience of the food system, the food supply chain, has really impressed me, of the people that are in the plants, the people that get the food to where it's needed. I think the way food is consumed, the way it's delivered, and the way people think about it is going to change dramatically. And so we're going to get in front of that. I mentioned healthy food ingredients, delivery systems that meet the new world where people are going to stay more isolated, more socially and physically distanced. We're going to have to change, and we will change. and we are already beginning our planning for that, for the
Okay.
future.
So a lot of people are depending on your health because you're running a big company. So tell us, how are you making certain that you don't get this virus and that you're healthy? Are you mostly walking around with masks? Are you mostly at home? What are you doing with your children and your family?
We're like everybody else. We're limiting who we interact with. If we're outside, we're always at least 6 feet away from other people, whether it's going for a walk around the block. As I mentioned, I was in the grocery store last night, and I wore a mask, and I wore gloves as well. So we're following all the guidelines of the state of Minnesota, of the CDC. I also think it's, one of the things you mentioned in terms of being in your own home. I think I've also set a record for the most consecutive nights in my own bed. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I'm getting better sleep. I'm getting more consistent exercise. And I think it's incumbent on anybody in a position of leadership, but anybody anywhere, to eat better and exercise better and to sleep well. And I think having these new routines means you can develop new routines and stay healthier for the future.
Okay. So no Zoom fatigue.
I do get Zoom fatigue, but I have the free Zoom where they cut you off after 40 minutes. And so that's great, because when the calls start getting, stale, then I get cut off. So I haven't paid up for the premium Zoom.
Well, listen, this has been a very interesting conversation, Dave. I want to thank you for giving us some insights into the food world. And I feel comforted that the food is going to be there at the supermarket when I go there later tonight to buy something, and presumably over the next couple of months as well. So thank you very much for giving us the insights, and I appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure, David. Thanks for choosing Cargill to talk about, and thanks for what you're doing for the country and what you always have done. It's a real honor to talk to you today.
Thank you. My pleasure.